There are only 3 STARS members left now. Captain Wesker, Jill, and myself. We don't know where Barry is.
Chris Redfield. Jill Valentine. Barry Burton. Rebecca Chambers. Albert Wesker.
Resident Chicken Zero.
I just watched a really cool documentary. I've been waiting for this documentary, I feel like, for a couple years now. I feel like I might have heard about this documentary when I was working at a different job, and that was like 2.5 years ago. So I think I've been waiting for this for a while. And that documentary was George A. Romero's Resident Evil. Now, this is a great story. I don't want to spoil the documentary. It was made by Brandon Salisbury, who I'm pretty sure played the zombie in this, didn't he? Very cool thing that Brandon Salisbury did and has worked on before is he made the short film The Keeper's Diary, a biohazard story. So I believe this individual to be very much into Resident Evil, and I'm going to talk about my experience with Resident Evil more so than the story that this documentary tells. Okay, so George Romero's covering my face. I'm gonna take this off here in just a second. Let's talk about the documentary. Great documentary. I enjoyed it. I loved it. It was very insightful. It is something that, as a horror fan, specifically a big fan of the zombie genre and all that, I'm very familiar with a lot of what I just watched. So this was kind of something for me to reminisce about, because I experienced this stuff in my life. But you younger people who may just be discovering George Romero's films, or you may just be discovering the series that's Resident Evil, and you're a younger person, there's a whole thing that happened in the late 90s, early 2000s that was pretty crazy for fans of either or. And typically, if you're a fan of Resident Evil, you're probably a fan of George Romero, or at least when Resident Evil came out, you were probably a fan of George Romero, or you became a fan of George Romero, depending on how old you were. We're going to get into all that. I don't want to go too far into this story specifically because the documentary does a wonderful job. It cost me $2.74 to rent on Amazon Prime. So if you want to go check it out, if you're a fan of Resident Evil, if you're a fan of horror, if you're a fan of George Romero, which I hope if you're into horror, you know who George Romero is. He's kind of a big deal, right? So they did a wonderful job of having respect for George Romero and talking about the story and kind of showing what fans of Resident Evil as well as George Romero could have gotten. You know, it was a missed opportunity. And so I think they did a wonderful job of telling that. And, not dogging Paul Anderson or, Too Hard or Constantine films or any of that stuff. They should be dogged. But it was very high class, well-made documentary. James Rolfe, the Angry Video Game Nerd, made an appearance in this. All kinds of people were in it. A lot of people were George Romero was a big deal, and I think this was an awesome documentary. So check that out. It's on everything. You can rent it or buy it for not too expensive. If it comes out on DVD, I will be picking up a copy. Brandon, Mr. Salisbury, I will be snagging up a copy. Also, check out The Keeper's Diary is really cool too. Okay. Why would I care about watching a documentary? Why would I care about watching a documentary to something that I already knew about? I think it's a really interesting story. It's happened a long time ago. I think there's a lot of people who don't know what happened. So let's kind of go into it a little bit. You guys are gonna get to know me a little bit here we're gonna have a chat about some things. Now, if you know me personally, you know I love zombie movies. I like The Walking Dead. I like all that stuff. I love Resident Evil. I named my show Resident Chicken Zero. I named it after Resident Evil. It's also appropriate. I continued the title Resident Chicken. Back in the day, David and I had a little like blog thing that we would put video game reviews on, and we called that Resident Chicken Zero. I came up with the name because I'm a chicken and I like horror. But it's even more appropriate now because my office is right next to a shitload of chickens are all around me at any given moment. And I don't know if you guys have noticed, but when Charlie and I are making our movies, like for Space Dog Maniacs and stuff, you'll hear chickens fucking making noises. And I leave them in because it's so fucking funny to me. So if I ever make a big feature-length movie, there's going to be chicken noises. I'm leaving them in. That's just what you hear where I live. You just hear these chickens. And I love them, you know? So Resident Chicken Zero, I got the name from Resident Evil. So let's talk about this. Before Resident Evil was a thing in my life, when I was a young Andrew, in the early 90s, my dad came home with some movies he had bought from a rental store. I think the rental store was Box Office Video in Dublin, California. The Box Office Video. And he brought home this movie and gave it to me. Night of the Living Dead. Now, I would not see the original Night of the Living Dead until years later when I was a little bit older. But I always was fascinated with the cover of this. If you know what Night of the Living Dead, it's a 1968 classic George Romero film, directed by George Romero with some other people who went on to do other things. George Romero made this crazy horror movie in the 60s, and it is, if you don't know what Night of the Living Dead is, I don't know why you're watching me or why you would care about me, but Night of the Living Dead is, to any independent horror filmmaker, which I'm a very amateur filmmaker, but I do strive to make more horror movies, Night of the Living Dead is the thing that would I would have to, like, anything that has inspired me throughout my life as an adult to want to make movies has to kind of give credit to Night of the Living Dead. It is like the ultimate independent film. They were screwed out of all the money they could have made from it because there was no ratings back then, right? So there's all this stuff with it becoming public domain and everything, and people will say it's because they changed the titles. I think the original title of Night of the Living Dead was Night of the Flesh Eaters, right? And it's heavily based off of one of my favorite novels, I Am Legend. Richard Matheson's I Am Legend. George Romero's talked about this. I Am Legend is actually a vampire story, but it kind of took the vampire lore and turned it into like an epidemic, and you have these rotting zombie vampire things waiting outside this guy's house to kill him, and he's the last human on Earth. Pretty great stuff. Short novel. Check it out. I Am Legend. Check out Night of the Living Dead. But the thing about this VHS that my dad got me, and I was really excited because I hadn't really seen like a lot of zombie stuff. Zombie movies weren't big in the 90s. There wasn't a whole lot. You would have to kind of go overseas for that stuff. And we'll get into it. You're going to say Resident Evil came out in the 90s. Yeah, no shit. The 80s had a huge boom of zombie movies because in the late 70s, George Romero did the first sequel to Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead. And Dawn of the Dead is like one of the biggest zombie movies, period. It's also probably George Romero's most successful and biggest movie. Like, Dawn of the Dead is amazing, okay? I'm not going to gush too much right now about zombie movies, but when I got this VHS, this isn't the original Night of the Living Dead. It is actually Tom Savini's Night of the Living Dead, which is also a wonderful movie, and this would kind of be George Romero's 90s zombie movie, because we didn't get that Resident Evil movie that this documentary is about, right? So Tom Savini, I believe, directed this, right? Great movie, and I would watch this pretty much every Saturday morning from like age 6 on, and I had seen part of this movie when I was probably like 3 or 4, and it scared the shit out of me when that zombie first shows up. They took the original scene from Night of the Living Dead where the zombie shows up, and it's scary at the time because this guy just shows up and kills this chick's brother, right? Kills Barbara's brother in the cemetery, and you're like, what the fuck? What's going on? I had seen the remake a million times by the time I saw the original Night of the Living Dead. And what they do is they have an old man show up, and you're like, oh shit, if you'd seen the original Night of the Living Dead, you're like, oh shit. And then this even worse zombie fucking comes out of nowhere, and it does a whole new take on that scene, which is great. So my first experience with a zombie is this fucking creepy zombie in the Tom Savini remake. I know that movie from beginning to end, and then as I got older, well, actually, when I was 7, probably from the same rental place, probably the Box Office Video down the street, my mom rented me Dawn of the Dead at the age of 7. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with the films Dawn of the Dead. It has one of the most graphic openings to a movie ever, even by today's standards. Like, Dawn of the Dead is fucked up. That's the first time I saw, even though it wasn't real and I knew it was a movie, that's the first time I saw a man bite into a woman's arm and take a piece of flesh out, which stuck with me. I don't even think I finished it. I think that movie fucked me up a little bit when I was 7. I remember telling my mom, like, I don't know if I'm ready for Dawn of the Dead, Mom. Like, this dude's, like, and then my mom came in and started watching, and she's like, oh, this is fucked up. You know, like, this might be too much for a 7-year-old. I think I revisited Dawn of the Dead when I was probably, like, 9 or 10, you know, and I was a little more into the gore. But, my first time seeing Dawn of the Dead, the beginning, all the violence stuff, I think I was 7. I was like a little kid. I had young parents, and this is in the 90s, so don't judge too much. There's videos during Christmas that I've uploaded of my mom blowing cigarette smoke in her face. It was just a different time. You just have to accept it. It's okay. She was a good mom. So I love zombie movies, and the reason I think people take this kind of, like, they're like, oh, well, Andrew loves zombie things. He always wants zombie stuff. He wants action figures of zombies, and he wants to make zombie movies. My first production company that we started in high school when we were making movies, we called it Zombie Crew Productions. That does not mean I ever really wanted to make zombie movies. I feel like zombies were done. Like, people had been doing zombies a lot. And when I was in high school in the early 2000s, it was done to fucking death. And we have the Paul Anderson Resident Evil to thank for that. That came out, I think, in 2001, right? Or early 2002. After that Resident Evil movie, we got Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later, which is fantastic. Then we got, like, Shaun of the Dead. And then we got the Dawn of the Dead remake. And then we got Land of the Dead. George Romero finally did get to do his zombie movie. And it was just, like, constant zombie movies. I like that stuff. And I would say that kind of turned into Walking Dead, I guess. And then that's been ran into the ground, right? So, it all goes back to Night of the Living Dead, and it was a big deal. So, all I had when I was a little kid, I saw Dawn of the Dead, and I had Night of the Living Dead. And I started at the beginning, right? Well, kind of. I started with the remake of the beginning in the early 90s, and I was obsessed with this shit. So, when I was 11, a huge game came out. I didn't play the first one for a while. So, when I was 11, and I played it on the PS1, my Aunt Nancy had it, Resident Evil 2 came out. So, 1998. And this game blew me away. This was the first time, and by this point I had watched a lot of horror movies. I've always liked scary movies. I was obsessed with Friday the 13th at a young age. I liked George Romero. I had seen all 3. By this point, by the time I played Resident Evil, Day of the Dead was actually my favorite out of the original Dead trilogy. I love Dawn of the Dead. I love Night of the Living Dead. Day of the Dead was like, that was my jam, dude. Dude, Day of the Dead is so good. I still will put Day of the Dead in, and it's my comfort food. A movie about people being stuck underground, killing each other, for some reason puts me at such an ease, like a comfort, like, it's like my sweater. I don't get it. I guess I saw it at an impressionable enough age. I love that movie so much. So, my obsession with zombies kind of started with that, and I would say movies like Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead are things that got me interested in horror. So, it's not even that this is a zombie game, because there's other things going on in this game, right? There's monsters and stuff. So, I played Resident Evil 2 when I was 11 at my Aunt Nancy's house. She was, like, helping me navigate, because I had never played such a crazy video game. I was still a pretty little kid. I was playing a horror movie in video game form. Like, it blew my fucking mind. The zombies were a nice addition, because I do like, you know, I like Evil Dead. I like Dawn of the Dead. I like all these zombie things, right? I loved 28 Days Later when that came out. That came out after I played this. But I was just, up to this point, it was fucking Zelda, Link to the Past, and, like, Super Mario World. And, like, I think the edgiest thing I had played before I played Resident Evil might have been, like, Kid Chameleon or something. Like, I wasn't playing like really like graphic games really. Mortal Kombat, you know, was like the violent game that I would enjoy, right? So Resident Evil was my introduction to horror gaming. And of course, after playing Resident Evil, the classic Resident Evil. This is my all-time favorite video game, though. I haven't played a game since Resident Evil 2 that captured my interest or my imagination quite like Resident Evil 2. I realize open world games are, you can do more and stuff. This will stick with me probably forever. I don't think that will ever stop being my number one game. This is pretty good. I didn't play through this until I was like 18 though. Resident Evil 2 and 3 were my big ones. When I just turned 18, Resident Evil 4 came out in 2005. And I got that in the same package as the original Resident Evil, and I played the shit out of both of those. I was familiar with what Resident Evil was, and I believe my Uncle Scott worked at Capcom when Resident Evil came out, and he had told me, because like I liked Altered Beast and stuff, like the werewolf game and stuff, and he was wearing something. I don't think it was Resident Evil, but he had a horror shirt on. And I was like, that's a really cool shirt, Uncle Scott. And he was like, dude, Capcom has like a zombie game coming out. And he kept telling me about it on the phone. I remember he told me one time when the Licker first shows up, he screamed and threw the controller on the ground. He didn't know, his mind didn't know. This guy made video games for years, for decades, and he didn't know how to accept, like, there's danger, like, coming to kill me right now. Like, it caught him off guard, right? So I got really excited. And so when I went down there to visit them in the Bay Area, I finally got to play Resident Evil 2. So I've stuck with that series this whole time. I played all of them. There's a shelf behind me. That top shelf is all Resident Evil stuff. All the movies, everything that I've ever purchased. I know there's way more than just that, but I'm a collector. Like, I love Resident Evil. So, I'm familiar with this shit. I love this shit. I love George Romero. He's one of my favorite filmmakers. The older I've gotten, the more... excuse me. The older I've gotten, the more I've realized, like, I like Quentin Tarantino. I think Quentin Tarantino is a great filmmaker. I even like what he thinks. Like, I read his book, what was that, Cinephile? I think that's up there, too. Great book. Talking about movies, right? I don't feel like I would want to go out of my way to hang out with Quentin Tarantino, necessarily. He doesn't strike me as a person, and I don't think he'd want to hang out with me either. Like, I'm not one of those people who, like, idolizes these guys, right? I think he's a cool guy who, made some of the best movies I've ever seen, and I like his work, right? George Romero is somebody I feel like the more I've, like, learned about him, the more I've studied why, what inspired him, I've looked into the context behind the original Night of the Living Dead and all these things that he would put into his movies, and the fact that he never really sold out. He's one of the few directors that can say, I didn't sell out. And I'm not calling Quentin Tarantino a sellout. I'm just pointing out, like, as much as I love Quentin Tarantino's movies, I feel like George Romero is, like, the man. Like, that guy was so undervalued and so underappreciated, and then when we lost him and he passed away, it was like, oh, here's a fucking plaque for him and shit. And it's like, he made one of the most influential horror movies, period. Like, even to this day. Night of the Living Dead is huge, and most horror fans are gonna sing its praises, right? There's not too many people that are like, Night of the Living Dead sucks. It doesn't. It's a great horror movie. Yeah, man, it's a shame. And I feel like maybe that's why I like this documentary so much. So, yeah, when people, especially when I was in high school, people would be like, oh, Andrew's a zombie guy, and, like, girls would be like, do you want me to dress up like a zombie? And it's like, I don't have a sexual attraction to dead corpses. I'm attracted to the fact that an independent group of filmmakers had nothing to do with Hollywood. They set out to make their own movie, and they did it, and it was super successful as far as, like, people wanted to see that movie. To this day, people want to see Night of the Living Dead. It still captivates audience. If you made a movie in 1968 and it's captivating somebody in 2025, do you understand, like, how fucking crazy that is? To me, I've made a couple movies, right? If I'll never have any idea if anybody truly loves my movie, right? I don't care. I did it. It's out there. You can watch it if you want to. But if I made a movie and 100 years later people were still watching that movie, that is way better to me than making any kind of money. I don't care about money when it comes to that shit. So And I feel like George Romero had that mindset too. He wanted to make cool movies. And so, long story short, the documentary goes over all this, but one of the biggest directors ever in horror was given a contract to do a screenplay to direct the first Resident Evil movie that Paul Anderson ended up making later on. And he got screwed out of it. And it was a bunch of bullshit. It's a common story. A lot of people know about it. I've read the screenplay that George Romero wrote. I read that years ago, and I was so fascinated. Like, he took some liberties in his screenplay. It wasn't completely accurate. But if only we had gotten that movie. And that screenplay's still there. So I'm hoping maybe somebody will watch this documentary. Maybe Brandon Salisbury is inspired. One of you motherfuckers should just take that screenplay, make the movie. And I realize it'd be expensive. Make a low budget version. Technology's a little more accessible. Make a cheap B flick version of that movie. I think that would be so fucking cool. And just put it online and fuck anybody who has a problem with it. I'm sure you get a cease and desist. And this wasn't in the documentary, but I've always said I like Paul Anderson's Resident Evil. I don't care so. With each sequel, it kind of got a little more like, okay, Anderson, like, calm down, dude. I like the fact that he did his own thing. I'm not necessarily against that, but to have George Romero and his name on something, and then to follow that up with and go, never mind, we're having creative differences. I want this guy. This guy's not going to have as much blood and gore in his movie, which is bullshit because there's a bunch of gore in it. It came down to money, you know what I mean? And that really, George Romero walked. He's not gonna sell out, right? Fuck that shit. He didn't even really like working on Land of the Dead. He felt like Land of the Dead was too big for what he wanted to do. He was like the best independent director ever. The only thing that bums me out is the way he felt at the end of his life. He felt very undervalued, and I think that sucks so much. I mean, he got Tom Savini going. He got Greg Nicotero going. And how many people have been inspired by Night of the Living Dead? Like, let's be honest here. Like, there's so many nerds out there who I've talked to about this. Like, those movies are fucking huge. Like, how many of you older people who are watching this, how many of you watched Dawn of the Dead on TV when you were a kid? Like, that's crazy, right? That he felt undervalued. That makes me so sad to think about. But, so a huge inspiration for me, and a big reason why I would want to be a filmmaker, is Resident Evil. Obviously, I love Resident Evil. I would like to make my own version of Resident Evil in movie form. It would not be Resident Evil, though. It would be... I think you could watch... I basically did what Paul Anderson did. So, you know, like, I wouldn't call it Resident Evil. It would be called something totally different. But if I ever make a zombie movie... I've only written one zombie movie. I've written a lot of movies. Where's my box? Oh, it's down there. There's a big-ass box in here somewhere, and it's full of screenplays and shit that I'd like to make one day if I ever have the means to. I'm super inspired. It is one of the most inspirational video games I ever played. I love that game. I can't have Resident Evil, and a lot of that inspiration doesn't just come from Resident Evil. It comes from George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. Like, and so that doesn't mean that I'm obsessed with zombies. Like, I think zombies are kind of been ran into the ground, right? But it inspires me to stay where I'm at in the world, not go to Hollywood, not deal with any of that bullshit, not deal with unions, not fucking kiss somebody's ass begging them for money. I have my own camera I bought. I got my own computer. I learned how to edit on my own. I'm learning all this stuff. I figured out how to get my college degree on my own. I figured out how to get a career started so I can feed my family and buy a house and take care of myself. And I will be able to fund my own shit in the future, right? So it might be another couple years before I make a feature-length movie, but... And I think a lot of that inspiration comes from guys like George Romero. Or Brandon Salisbury. Is it Brandon Salisbury? Am I already fucking this guy's name up? Let's make sure it's Brandon Salisbury. Brandon, is it you? Brandon Salisbury. Yeah, it is Brandon Salisbury. Okay, thank you, Brandon Salisbury. I'm glad that you had the respect, the like he worked on this documentary for a while. This is a big deal to me, and it might not be. It might be too boring for some people. It's literally a documentary talking about how George Romero made a screenplay for Resident Evil, and nothing came of it. And it's 2 hours long, and I was captivated. I loved it. I enjoyed reminiscing about all the things that I've enjoyed over the years from George Romero. It's not just Night of the Living Dead. We got Creepshow. We got what was it? Martin, the vampire movie's great. We got the one with the motorcycle knights. The Crazies. He made all these Monkey Shines. He did all these cool fucking movies, and he did them himself in Pittsburgh, and there's something so cool about that to me. Last but not least, something else. So you got Night of the Living Dead, and it inspired these Japanese dudes at Capcom. They were remaking a video game called Sweet Home. I will play Sweet Home in the future. I've played it before, but I want to play through Sweet Home. Sweet Home's great. It's based off of another Japanese movie. It's about ghosts. It's on the NES. You're in a mansion with ghosts, monsters. So one of the guy who made Sweet Home ended up becoming a producer at Capcom. He wanted to remake Sweet Home, and what ended up happening is he decided he didn't want to do something supernatural. Supernatural's not as scary as let's do zombies, right? There's mock-ups of the original Resident Evil, and they're crazy. There's it was a little out there, and they kind of made it a little more accessible and normal for an audience. I will talk more about Sweet Home. I would like to talk more about this George Romero screenplay. So I encourage you to go check out this documentary. It's great. And maybe we'll read off of it, or something I've always wanted to do. Adam Green from Arioscope Films does this. It would be fun to do a table read of the George Romero Resident Evil. So somebody else beats me to it, and you can get some people to do the voices and stuff. I would watch that in a heartbeat. But I think it'd be fun on Resident Chicken Zero to do a table read for what could have been the coolest Resident Evil movie ever. We've kind of got we got a little close to there being kind of a decent Resident Evil movie. I really liked Welcome to Raccoon City. I enjoyed it a lot, but it wasn't quite there. It didn't get. The Paul Anderson movies made over $1 billion, right? The Paul Anderson movies were successful. Constantine Films was interested in making money. The George Romero movie, though, I don't think it would have been as undervalued as everybody's saying. Land of the Dead, people said, wasn't that great when it first came out, right? Land of the Dead is a great fucking zombie movie. People like Land of the Dead, right? It got its audience. So I don't think a more dark, violent Resident Evil. I think people wanted that. And after, I read the screenplay years ago. It'd be fun to go through it again after watching this documentary. I don't think it was a bad screenplay, man. He took some liberties, but it was Resident Evil's based off something he did years ago. He was the man. He could have handled that transition, I think. He studied the video game. There was stuff from the game in the movie. There was more stuff from the game in George Romero's movie than there was in Anderson's movie, So fascinating stuff. So yeah, no, I'm not necessarily the zombie guy, but I am inspired by this stuff a lot. Give me 1 second. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so I don't know what the fuck I was saying because I just got interrupted by my beautiful wife. But yeah, man, this is the kind of shit that now that I got internet in here, we're gonna get the office set up better. I'm working on it. I started this stream. I want to play video games because I like video games, but I want to talk about movie stuff more often, and I think we did pretty good. Our most popular episodes that we did, I kind of did a little stretch, right, for Resident Chicken Zero, just to kind of test out how I want to do the show. Our most popular episodes were when we were excuse me. When we were watching B movies. We were watching stupid horror movies that you probably never heard of, right? Those were the most popular streams I did. So I want to do more of that. And I think what the trick would be, because I don't want to get in trouble for playing other people's content and stuff. I think the trick to that would be to maybe do more conversations, or, get David on here and talk about some of the stuff that we've watched together. one of my favorite things that I ever did with David one night was I showed him Return of the Living Dead. Like, one of my favorite nights with David was watching David enjoy this movie that I had been watching since I was a kid. We were almost grown by this point. And his mind was fucking blown when he saw the Tarman. He was like, holy shit, this guy's like, you know, ripping the doors off the locker and these things are talking. Like, Return of the Living Dead blew David's mind. That was so enjoyable for me. Or, you know, showing people the Toxic Avenger and stuff like that. So I really think that is kind of what I want to do as far as movies go on here. When we start doing the stream again, I would like to spend more time like talking about these things. Because on the off chance I don't ever make another movie, like I have made movies, you know, I feel happy, like I feel like this is a hobby, right? Maybe I can inspire, you know, somebody to become the next George Romero. Maybe I can get another, you know, Quentin Tarantino. These guys are all like huge movie people. George Romero's like at the beginning of the film industry, right? Like he was at the start, you know. Him and Martin Scorsese were like, isn't there a story where they're renting the same movie from the archive in like New York? Like one guy, yeah. Anyways, I know he wasn't like, you know, in the silent film era, but he was born in the 40s. Like Homeboy got his going, you know, he got going pretty early on. So, but he liked. There's stories about George Romero seeing Frankenstein and stuff, and that inspiring him, you know, and that's just cool to me. I like that. I'm more interested. Here's the thing about like my fellow 40-year-old dudes who are into horror movies. You guys are so quick to review things. You guys want to put numbers on things. You want to be like, Night of the Living Dead, 8 out of 10. I've complained about this with Magic the Gathering too. I don't want to start talking about Magic when I'm talking about movies, but like people are asking me my deck level. It's like I don't necessarily want to put a number on it, because I could say my deck is a 7, or I could say this movie's an 8. But there's so much more to the situation. There's so many more variables. It's more complicated than that. I would rather, instead of talking about something I absolutely hate, I would rather get on here and be like, hey, I just saw a really cool documentary. It's $2 on Amazon Prime right now. You got a free night. Go rent that shit. It's $5 max. If the sale goes away, it's $5 to rent it, right? Go check out this doc. If you like Resident Evil and you like George Romero, this is a great documentary to watch. I feel so much better about that than if I'm like, man, I just saw the new Sonic the Hedgehog 3 with my son, and what a blah blah. They didn't do Jim Carrey dancing with himself. Like, who fucking cares, right? But like, George Romero, the guy who started the zombie genre, was gonna make a Resident Evil movie at one point. That screenplay's still out there. One of you my goat's hungry. You hear that? That's a goat. Maybe this should be Resident Goat Zero. I am the goat, so that would actually... I'm not much of a chicken anymore. I got distracted. Yeah, go fucking get that screenplay. Somebody make a Resident Evil movie. I'm sure... Is there a fan-made Resident Evil, like... Did somebody already take that screenplay and do a fan-made movie? We're getting fucking 5 Friday the 13th fan-made films every fucking week. Why can't I get a Resident Evil... The Friday the 13th fan-made films, they got Tom Matthews in one of those fucking things, right? They're pretty high up. Those Friday the 13th... If if I ever have any money, I'm going to do a Friday the 13th movie, fan film. I'm telling you right now, it's going to happen. Let's get Resident Evil fan-made films. There's some pretty cool ones. The guy who made this documentary did the Keeper's Diary. That I was like, this is pretty cool. Let's start doing that with Resident Evil. Let's just keep cranking out those Resident Evil fan-made films for me to churn through on the toilet. What do you guys think? Alright. Well, my wife's on her way home to make me an egg sandwich. I was gonna play some Shining Force, but I'm pretty tired from work today, so that'll have to wait for another time. I love you all. I hope you guys have a great night. I'm gonna actually go take my pants off and fart on the toilet for a couple minutes before my wife gets here, so I don't have to fart in front of her.